So the season of Advent and the fact that we are in the book of Mark. The book of Mark is thought to have been the first of the Gospels that were written. It was thought to have been written sometime around 60 or 70 CE, which stands for Common Era, which is the era that we are in, not error, as you did something wrong, but era that we are in. And so when you think back, it was written somewhere in the 60s or 70s. So the writer of this was living at a time and telling about Jesus walking on the earth, such as one of us deciding to sit down and write about the day that the Challenger exploded. It's that same amount of time. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I could write down a pretty good history of what went on at that point in time. We were living here in Clear Lake, and so it really hit home strongly about that happening. So it's that amount of time that happened. It's attributed to being written to a gentleman named John Mark. And he supposedly, in the book of Acts, you'll find him that he was with Barnabas, and Barnabas was with Paul. And so you'll read about him through the book of Acts. Obviously, with anything in the Bible, there's people that are going to contest that. But the standard thing is that John Mark was the person that wrote the book of Mark. And it was written at a time when the second temple was being knocked down. And it was being destroyed because the Romans had come in, and so there was all these political battles going on. Can you believe that? Political unrest in the Middle East? Who would have thought that? And so that was what was going on at the time that this was written. And the whole thing about it. Now, the thing about Mark is that everything Mark does, what he wants it quickly, immediately, all of these words that come through that. And so it's the shortest book. It's the one that people recommend if you want to read a gospel during Lent. If you read one chapter a day, you'll get all the way through the book of Mark during the season of Lent. So it's the guy on Dragnet that said, "The facts, ma'am, just the facts." That's what Mark is. They don't put any extra words in there. English teachers would not like Mark at all because there's nothing flowery about it. It's just this happened and then this happened and immediately this happened. And as we go through it, you'll see in the structure in the writing how it's just really quick and like that. Everything that is in Mark is in Luke and in Matthew. But not everything in Matthew and Luke is in Mark, with the exception of one story. There is one parable that is only in Mark, and it's one about a mustard seed. And there's a lot of mustard seed ones, but when we get to that, I'll point it out, that this is the only place you'll find it in the Bible. So again, what's happening in today's gospel is that Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he is explaining to the disciples that something's going to happen. And he's quoting Genesis, the God created the heavens and the earth and everything. And then he's also quoting bits of the Old Testament where it talks about the sky's going to turn black and everything's going to happen and it's going to be bad times. And so he's setting up his audience to say, this is going to come. And when it comes, know that God's going to be there. Everything else might be gone, but God's going to be there. And so that's the story, or that's what Jesus is trying to tell the disciples at the time. And that's the story that Mark kind of has. And the reason this is important is because the temple is where in ancient Israel they thought God resided. If you remember when they were driving through or walking through the desert for 40 years, that God was there in the clouds during the day and the fire at night. And then when they built the temple, they had the Holy of Holies, and that's where Zechariah was when the angel came and said, you're going to have a child and all of that. And so this Holy of Holies was this special place where God resided. Well, as a child, I thought of this Holy of Holies kind of like being at my grandmother's living room. I don't know if y'all grew up in a house like this, but kids were not allowed in the living room. Anybody else have that experience? And both my grandmother and my mother had green velvet couches in the living room, of which when you vacuumed, everything would go one way. So if you even touched it, they could tell your handprint was on that couch. So I can remember as a young child, my grandmother had this beautiful painting. It was this Elizabethan woman, and she had this special lighting on it, and she had this gorgeous dress on. And I can remember standing as close as I dared to in the hallway, staring at this beautiful painting and thinking, I wish I could get closer, but I knew better than to walk into that living room. So I kind of took that same feeling into the church when I was little. And the church that I went to when I was 7 and under was the Second Presbyterian Church of Little Rock. But it was downtown, and people weren't living downtown anymore. Everybody was moving out to the suburbs. So those on the edge Presbyterians said, let's leave this church. I don't know what it is with the Presbyterians. They just love to move from church to church and build a new one out into the suburbs. That counted with also the government that wanted to buy the land the church was on and build a post office there. So they got a good price for it, and they moved out into the suburbs. And this brand new church was gorgeous. It was absolutely gorgeous. And the sanctuary was huge, and you could stand in it, and had the choir loft, and it had the big pipe organ, and the musician played the harpsichord, so it had a harpsichord too, and all the stained glass windows it's kind of like this. It was on the inside, so they were all backlit up and just absolutely gorgeous. And the table was there up front, and that was like the living room, because this was God's house after all, right? The church is God's house. So this was the living room, and we were told as young children, don't go in the sanctuary. Well, I look back on that now, and I think that really is not what you want to tell a bunch of kids. You want to tell them, come into the sanctuary. We want you here. But at that time, you didn't come into church until you were 7 or 8. You stayed in the nursery until then, because who wanted to have a bunch of children making a lot of noise in church? So my best friend and I, Caroline Carville, we knew we were not supposed to be in that church, but we got out of choir early on a Wednesday night, and we wanted to go peek into God's house. And so it took both of us to open those big heavy wood doors that were there. And so we opened them, and we walked in, and they shut behind us. And they had everything lit. They had this chalice that stayed out on the table all week long. Now, Dr. Boggs was the pastor there, and every time he came out, he had this black preaching robe on that had all of these velvet sleeves on them that were huge. He must have burned up, that's all I can say as an adult. But he would have that, and he would clear his throat, and he would be very thoughtful in the message that he had to say. So during the week, this chalice was there, and they had these lights pointed on it just perfect. So in the dark of night, these lights shone on that, and it shattered the light all around it. Now, Caroline and I were sure at age 8 that that was God's eye, knowing that we had come into the sanctuary, aka the living room of God's house that we weren't supposed to be in. And so we immediately shot out of there, and it was like, is he going to tell our parents that we were in here? Both of us were scared for the longest time that we had been in God's living room when we weren't supposed to. And so what Jesus is trying to tell the disciples in our message today is that God isn't just in the living room, that God isn't just in the Holy of Holies, and that this, at the time that this gospel is being written, the entire temple, the second one, had been totally destroyed. And so what Jesus is saying, what Mark is saying through Jesus is, we know this is going to happen. We don't know when. We know it's going to, so don't be upset, because God will still be with you. For some of you, it's going to be the end of your life when all of this comes. And for others, don't think that I'm not with you because all of this horrible stuff has happened. But know that I am with you always, which are the very last words that we read today. Because the first season in Advent, every single time, regardless of if you're in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, is this eschatological, I am with you always to the end of time, forever and ever and ever. And guess what? It popped up again this year. So what Advent's about is that Jesus is coming. Jesus comes in the end times, the eschatological times. Jesus comes to us every single week when we come up for communion, comes up in the sacrament. And then the big one, Jesus comes to us in human form on Christmas Eve, the baby in the manger. God is with us all the time, is what the message is, even when we go into that forbidden living room and even when we sit on the green velvet couch. God is with us in our time out. And all God's people say, amen.